make a start, if I may. Can I introduce myself? I'm Sandy Nan, Director of the National Portrait Gallery, and delighted to be here this evening to say a few words of introduction to a lecture I've given by Professor Henry Lydiate under the title of Creative Act Revisited, New Ways of Working, New Challenges. Now, the first thing I have to say to you is that this is going to sound very bossy, this is to be put away. This is for taking home. Henry assures me that what you're going to get this evening is his creative act, interpreting the earlier creative act, and he needs your full attention. So this is putting away. But I am delighted to say a word of introduction because Henry is someone I've admired over decades, and it's back in the early 70s when I was starting out in contemporary art world that Henry had already made a name and position for himself in terms of creating art law services. And without enunciating at length all the wonderful things that art law services did, what I just wanted to pick out was, in a sense, why was that important? And why are the important things, I think, that Henry was doing then leading through to things that matter very much today? And I think it revolves around three words in my mind. The first word is legitimate, the second word is legitimacy, and the third is advocacy. Now, the legitimate, part of what Henry was helping all of us, I think, in the contemporary world particularly, was just sorting out what the hell was legitimate. What could be done by artists and what couldn't be done by artists? What could be done by galleries and what could not be done? And frankly, also, crucially, the other word should. What should not be done, or anything could be done and might be done and should be done, but maybe shouldn't be done by the institutions. These were questions that were not well answered. If you go to think back to the 50s and 60s, they were not ones that many people necessarily wanted to face. But it leads me to my second word, because what I would say about what Henry's work was doing at that period and since was because of facing up to the questions that on one hand were legal, were about actually what is the law and how do we understand it and how do we use it. By facing those things, it provided a legitimacy, it provided actually a proper framework for how people could do their work. Now, some of that was a framework that artists needed to make sure they might get paid, to make sure they might get respected properly, that their works would not be inappropriately placed, positioned, misused. But also in a sense, and that's all sounding rather negative and sort of risk-averse, but actually on the other side, giving confidence, a legitimacy in that sense of confidence in a changing world and a changing framework, I would argue, for contemporary art. Because I would argue very much that it's the 70s that is one of the really crucial decades that we've taught, including my own institution. One of the things in the 60s has just been devoured by 60s pop photographs, which has been wonderful. But actually, if you think of the 70s, we know in terms of ideas what's happening in feminism, what's happening in cultural diversity, what's happening in so many other areas, the crucial areas of change in terms of art and social thinking around it. Which leads to my last word about advocacy, because I think what Henry and art law and his work as a consultant for a period as judge and many other great and distinguished things in between, what it was really doing was providing a kind of advocacy for crucially artists centrally, and in a sense through that, for many others working with artists, supporting artists, whether gallerists on the commercial side, or whether public institutions on the museum side, or in terms of commissions, whether colleges, and many other institutions. That advocacy was actually crucial to be based on the understanding of what was legitimate, to see that there was a framework of legitimacy of what could be better understood. And that advocacy, it seems to me, has got us not everything solved. We were just saying to each other, much changes, new areas of dispute, new areas of disagreement, think of the web, think of much else. But actually, an advocacy which I think we shouldn't take for granted, and we should recognize that the advocacy for and with artists is crucial to all of us. But I'm going to say no more, but introduce Henry Lydiate for his platform professorial lecture. Henry, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for those kind words. And thank you also to the university for inviting me a few years ago to become a visiting professor, and also to Lynn Finn, who looks after the visiting professors at the university and has organised with her colleagues this evening, and I'm very pleased to be here. And also thank you all for coming. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to be doing this. And in Sandy's words about, please put this away, I said to Lynn, you would like me to write a text about what I'm going to say? Am I supposed to be reading a paper? And the answer is no, I'm not reading a paper. So what's in here is a kind of narrative sort of amplification, as Sandy says, a goodie bag to take away, or maybe not a goodie bag, but something. Because those of you who know the way I talk about this kind of material that I'm going to do this evening will know that I extemporize based upon what I'm going to use here, which is a PowerPoint with some images and also some sound at a certain point. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so. Hopefully I won't run over. I am notorious for going right over the time. So please, give me a kick, Sandy. Thank you.
Got a foot here.
Okay. And also, I prefer on this occasion to get through the things I'd like to explore with you and have time for questions, which Sandy will sort of coordinate at the end. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, then please remember, make a note, whatever. The starting point, of course, is the Duchamp thing. But before that, I just want to talk about a couple of things that arise from the examples that I'm hoping to explore with you. Something about that, something about being free to be completely anarchic, something about taking on the establishment, something about very non-conventional work and generation of income. How do you do it? What's the magic trick? And something about the art market itself in the context of the examples that I'm hoping to explore with you. Duchamp was the starting point for just being stimulant. I'm going to put the light off here, otherwise you won't see any of the images and you can't read that text anyway. So hopefully the lights will go down. There we are. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm very fond of this image because I think it wasn't a complete retrospective. Being so close to Tate, and Sandy will correct me if I get this wrong, because I know you were a very senior officer there with Nick Sirota some years ago. I think this was Duchamp at Pasadena in '63, and Eve Babbitt was with him playing chess for a period of time through the show. And you can see examples or not examples, you can see some of Duchamp's work there. Chess was obviously an important issue for him, for those of you who know about him. And the large glass is the backdrop there. But I thought it was important I was stimulated to, when thinking about what to talk about here on this platform, by Duchamp, and particularly that little lecture he gave, and it was a little lecture, it was only about 7 minutes long, but I really commend it to you if you have never read it. It's called The Creative Act, and you can find the text of it online, and I was fortunate enough to be able to find a sound recording of it. I'm going to play you a little extract of him actually saying some of the key things. That was, Eve Babbitt said, I've got to get my titles right, okay. And then, that was his lecture. That's what was my stimulation for thinking about things. It was Houston, Texas. And I'm going to play you just about 2 or 3 minutes of edited extracts.
Let us consider 2 important factors, the 2 poles of the creation of art. The artist on the one hand, and on the other, the spectator, who later becomes the posterity. Millions of artists create. Only a few thousands are discussed or accepted by the spectator, and many less again are consecrated by posterity. In the last analysis, the artist may shout from all the rooftops that he is a genius. He will have to wait for the verdict of the spectator in order that his declarations take a social value, and that finally, posterity includes him in the primers of art history. I know that this statement will not meet with the approval of many artists who refuse this mediumistic role and insist on the validity of their awareness in the creative act, yet art history has consistently decided upon virtues of a work of art through considerations completely divorced from the rationalized explanation of the artist. To avoid a misunderstanding, we must remember that this art coefficient is a personal expression of art à l'état brut, that is, still in a raw state, which must be refined as pure sugar from molasses by the spectator. The digit of this coefficient has no bearing whatsoever on his verdict. The creative act takes another aspect when the spectator experiences the phenomenon of transmutation. Through the change from inert matter into a work of art, an actual transubstantiation has taken place, and the role of the spectator is to determine the weight of the work on the aesthetic scale. All in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualification, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act. This becomes even more obvious when posterity gives the final verdict and sometimes rehabilitates forgotten artists.
There you have the great man and his words. And as I said to you before, that's an edited version of what he said. Just some key ideas that I wanted to share with you, and some of which I've quoted in the text. Why I'm revisiting some of his ideas in the context of this platform is one of his key points there that you heard him say is about the role of the artist to bring the work to the spectator. There are millions of artists, as he says, who create, and many of them don't necessarily think about bringing the work to the spectator. It's an autonomous act of creativity, yes, and they say, I've made the work, now I'll go and find a spectator. One of the features, I think, of Duchamp's works is that it's clear not only from his titles, but from also the way they are presented to you, that the thought about how can I generate a response from the spectator is very palpable from his works. And some of the artists that I'm going to explore with you as examples of that thinking have very strongly thought about how they can actually involve the spectator in making what Duchamp calls the creative act complete by being involved in the experience of the work. The other reason why I'm revisiting Duchamp in the context of this talk to you is this point about there's no doubt that Duchamp removed, not alone, but was responsible for, in large part, removing the boundaries of creative practice traditionally, and started to explore other things and other ways, other things that art could be, what other things that art practice could be, and other ways in which art could be made. One of the things that's always interested me is I once said to Richard Hamilton, name dropping, but Richard Hamilton, I know was a friend of Duchamp and was very responsible for a lot of his recognition, especially in the United Kingdom. Is that I said to him, you were so much enthralled by Duchamp, obviously, and so much influenced by him as the older artist who you discovered and was excited by. Is it interesting, Richard, that your work took a completely different direction from Duchamp's work? And his response was something to the effect of saying, in terms, well, one of the things I learned above all else from Duchamp was to actually be as original as you could be and not tread a traditional path and find something that's new. Therefore, for me, I had to be, if I was going to be true to Duchamp, I had to be, to find a way of working that was not Duchamp's way of working, but which was my way of working, which I thought was an elegant way of Richard putting it. But the effect that he had on removing the boundaries was felt very strongly towards the end of the 20th century, and certainly not very much during his lifetime. What I was going to say about Tate, Sandy, about your own involvement, was that, correct me again if I'm wrong on this, was it 67 that there was the retrospective when Norman Reed was there? And it was like, it was going to be called the complete works of Marcel Duchamp. And I think it was the first worldwide retrospective. And very significant it was too. The first time in 1967. And of course they couldn't have the large glass brought over from Philadelphia because it was cracked and it couldn't survive the journey. So Richard Hamilton famously rebuilt or made a replica of the large glass and included it in the show. And Duchamp was very pleased with it by all accounts, and in fact I think signed it on the back. But the point, and then also the title of the show was changed to be the almost complete works of Marcel Duchamp, which I thought was elegant. But it wasn't until around then that he began to take hold in the hearts and minds and practices of not only artists but other practitioners and curators, scholars, critics, writers, and so on. And sadly, and I make this point in the text that I've written, sadly, I always feel very sad when I think about that last comment he made about, that I played to you, about posterity takes a view, makes a judgment, and sometimes, his last phrase was, rehabilitates forgotten artists. 3 months or 6 months after the end of that show, he died. And he didn't see or experience the recognition that he's been given now and the influence that he's had on generations, subsequent generations of artists. So that's another reason for me choosing Duchamp and the text. So there's that point there, the influence he's had, and also artists beginning to throw away the traditional ways of working. Not everybody, obviously, and there's nothing wrong at all in anybody's judgment with the traditional ways of working, but there have been new and imaginative, inspired ways of working. And that's what I want to explore in some of the examples now. The first one is obvious. I just chose that virtually at random, but it was London anyway. And so it's Banksy, South Bank, 2, and then the other one, which I always really amused me, even though it's a really challenging issue. It's called, you know, it's on the West Bank, Gaza, Israel, you know, all that stuff, and Palestine. Called it Wall and Peace. And just some thoughts about Banksy. For many years, he had no gallery. He was working on his own. He was the urban guerrilla, the hip-hop artist. Not selling any objects, not taking that traditional route, saying, well, you know, I have something to sell. Can I generate income for my practice by selling objects? He used the environment as a gallery. It's pretty common for us now to think about those things. But he chose a very important and special route for himself. Skillfully avoiding legal challenges in the sense that, you know, he could have got arrested for defacing other people's property, criminal damage. You know, he put his hoodie on and he went out 4 o'clock in the morning with his stencils and his spray paint and all that stuff just to get his work there. So this thing about, you know, Duchamp's point about thinking about bringing the work to the spectator's experience, he went out and used the environment as not only his canvas, but also his gallery, and saying, my spectators are there, the general public who can find and be interested in looking at the things that I've done. The urban guerrilla, and now, of course, he's become an artist who's operating within the commercial dimension. He gets works commissioned. He now has a gallery. Or he used to have a gallery, which was Steve Lazaridis. I think that stopped very recently. And now has his own business, his own website, and his works have found a marketplace. People are saying, can we have a copy of your works? He uses his stencils to do works on paper and sells them in typical kind of urban guerrilla hip-hop fashion only on eBay. You know, like you can pay what you can afford. But he does other works in more traditional mediums like on canvas and so on and so forth, which he sells to private collectors. And of course there's even that work, did you hear about that story about the couple in Bristol where when he was a student he made a work which is virtually a mural on the side of a gable end of a house, a terraced house, and when he was a student, and it never got removed, it was always there, it was signed by him. And then a couple moved in and owned the house, and they went to sell the house a few years ago, went to an estate agent and said, can we sell the house, what's it worth, wasn't worth very much, 2 up, 2 down, and all that stuff. And the estate agent came along and said, it's not worth very much, this house, but actually, this thing on the side of the wall is probably worth more than the house, because it's a Banksy. And they said, who's Banksy, what's on? Anyway, to cut a long story short, instead of selling the house through an estate agent, they went to a gallery and said, can we sell it through you as a work of art? So here it is. You can buy a work of art from Banksy, it happens to be a mural, and oh, by the way, you can get a house on top of it as well. So he was playing around with the marketplace and was able to do that. So found ways of selling objects, which he's now done, still retains total anonymity, and yes, I can assure you that he does exist. Some people think otherwise. And there's that story that happened recently about there are lots of Banksy type works emerging in New York, and there was sign, Banksy New York City, Banksy NYC. And the urban myth was going around saying, this is somebody else. This is somebody who's ripping Banksy's style off. Is that a violation of copyright, Henry? No, it's not. You can violate anybody's style and appropriate anybody's style. Oh yeah, but you know, they're not actually copying his works, but you know, is there a trademark infringement? Is there a passing off infringement? Whatever. Why are you worried about this? And people were debating it, and I think still are. The answer to your question, to those questions is, Banksy New York City is the same person. He's just extended his brand by adding NYC onto it. So there is a market value. Okay, I want to now move on to somebody else. Anybody? Who's that? Who's that work? Allison Jackson, yeah, okay. There's another one. If you've not seen that one before. Very humorous. Can you, somebody asked me earlier today, Sandy, can I deface a banknote with the Queen's face on it? You know, is it treason? You know, can I do it? I want to build it into my artwork. I said, well, not only can you deface a banknote if you want to, but it's no longer treason, no longer hanging offence, drawing a quarter, but you could actually do what Alison's done with that, which is the look-alike, and defame the Queen, and she's hardly likely to bring a lawsuit against you for defamation of character. Although I suppose other faces would. But Beck's didn't. So, Allison, I think, is really interesting in this context. You can see the point there. It's conventional media. She had a television program, series of programs that were broadcast, I think, was it BBC Two, I think? Some of you, was it? Yeah? And, you know, it's the look-alike, and as an element of her art form, but it's more conceptual than just the visual. It's not about just the visual. Again, echoes of Duchamp there, I think. She does it as an artist when she did her television programs, not as a television producer. I'm using broadcast medium as my canvas, in the traditional speak. As an artist, I want to achieve these objectives, and I'm going to use television and lookalikes and everything else. And she skillfully uses laws. She has, I don't advise Allison Jackson, but I know that there are people who advise her and say, she said, how far can I go with this? How far can I go with that? You know, if we were to do this, would we risk a writ or a lawsuit or whatever it may be? in her territory. And it's an element in her research and preparation for the works we eventually see and experience and find most times humorous as well as challenging sometimes. Here's a little quotation from her, which I think is just sums it all up. The colour doesn't, right. The boundaries between reality and the imaginary, the confusion between the two, we create scenes as a great sphere, fiction. Interesting territory to occupy. And she has to negotiate, as I say, business and practical issues about people being freaked out by what she does, particularly celebrities. Want to move on again, and just, it's an obvious one in this context, you may think, and I think it is obvious. One of the earliest pair of practitioners, Christo and Jean-Claude, the wrapping of the Reichstag. Sadly, Jean-Claude died last year, a couple of months ago. What was interesting about those wrapped Reichstag night, one of the things that I thought was interesting, one of the little interesting things for me, was that Christo was working on his own. Christo was not working on his own, was mostly working with Jean-Claude for most of his career. But in the early, maybe it was a decade or so, you would know it again, Sally better than me, it was all work by Christo. And then eventually, he felt that either the curatorial or spectator or commercial marketplace was able to take, we talked about feminism before and all that stuff, would take the idea that maybe the works were actually created by two artists together, and it was Christo and Jean-Claude. But what I thought was sweet and absolutely appropriate, that at a certain point, after decades of work, the early pieces of which were labelled as Christo the author, they designated all the other works back to the beginning as both their works, because they viewed them as both having been the authors. So that raised legal issues about who owns the rights to reproduce or to otherwise merchandise elements of their work. And one of my favourites from a kind of pure art law perspective was the running fence on the west coast of the United States. If you're not aware of that, I mean, I just think it's an amazing practical project where they built this fence there, as you can see, across the landscape for miles and miles and miles, from, I think, the foothills of whatever the mountain range was there, right down to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, the challenges for doing it were enormous. Just some commentary on that. Oh, it's 24 miles. You have to go to the landowners and say, can we use your land? Can we put this fence? Can you imagine? We want to put this curtain across your land. Excuse me? What when? For how long? How much will you pay? Are you earning any money from this? Are you earning any money? No income? No generation? Why are you doing it? What's it about? So eventually he got, or they, as we should say, got all the permissions that they needed, except they forgot to ask the California Coastal Commission, can we interfere with the landscape on the coast? So they were prosecuted and fined. But nevertheless, the artwork got done. Yes, they use the environment as a gallery. Yes, they intervene and change it. Again, the work goes to the spectator's environment. It's not come to us and see the work. It's saying, how can we get this out to people? What can we do in the public environment? Massive challenges. And each work, I've not been involved. I know the lawyer who supports the work of Christo's, based in Chicago, who has really fun time doing it. But it's a business project. Where do you get the money? You know, how do you raise it? how you're going to spend it, how you're going to negotiate all the legal and business issues involved in all of that, and over an extended period of time. Sometimes, Christophe, Jean-Claude, and other people who work in that kind of environmental way can actually use their intellectual property rights in their projects to sell them in advance to the media, to have the media be given exclusive rights to either broadcast or talk about or podcast or whatever it is nowadays. And in a way, that's the way in which sometimes the money is raised, but also the related documents about it, which is a secondary experience, obviously, of the work. Drawings, collages, photographs, works on paper are signed and sold as limited editions. They have the rights in those, it's their work. And I always think of the comparison between a rock band on tour, you know, you've got all this ephemera, all this secondary merchandise from the actual experience itself. You can make an awful lot of money as a rock band from that, sometimes more than the tickets at the gig, unless they're really ridiculously expensive, which increasingly they are, as we know. But it's that kind of thinking that says, what have we got to sell? We're not selling an object, we're not in a gallery, what can we do about it and how can we generate income? Good thinking, imaginative thinking, and good use of law and business. Inevitably, I had to mention Hirst in this context. I think that was in the edition of 2 or 3. Hirst, him, 96. I think Saatchi bought one of those. Was in his gallery. I think it's in it still. Is it still in his collection? I think it is, isn't it? And then one was bought by a New York collector. I think there were 3. But anyway, for a lot of money. Some thoughts in the context, especially of Banksy. He now has a factory. You know, I know he's reduced the people. He has people making things for him. Although recently he did those paintings in the World's collection, which he says were his own handwork, and I have no reason to doubt that. Huge demand for him. It enabled him to sustain a production line of employees. And of course, having those people making those works that were in demand, the spots, the butterflies and so on, freed him up in terms of not only his time but also finances to explore the more controversial and experimental work, and therefore hopefully stimulating more demand for him or his future work, like for example the For the Love of God, the diamond encrusted human skull, which is also an interesting story in itself. What's the value of the diamond encrusted skull? What's the market value of the diamond encrusted skull? Anybody know? Anybody know? Very interesting. He spent 11 million pounds on buying the diamonds, and then took them to diamond setters or whoever it was, and said, put these around this titanium skull. Said, there it is, my work, 11 million pounds. And then said, my asking price is 35 million pounds. Who wants to buy it? Nobody bought it. Didn't put it into auction, didn't put it into a deal, and said, who wants to buy it? Lots of publicity. A consortium of collectors bought it. 4 or 5 collectors bought it for, it is set for 35 million. Whether that's true, I don't know, because it was a private sale, but that's what it's rumoured to be. Who were the consortium? People like his gallery, White Cube, himself, and a couple of other people. So they only joined a very interesting kind of legal issue about, do they form a partnership contract and then buy it and have something, a deal, and of course it's now on tour. The asking price, I understand, is 50 million pounds. The market value at the moment is 35, if what we're told is true, or the rumour is true, that it was bought by the consortium for 35. Whether it sells 50 or more or less, I don't know. Very, very, very successful promoting his own image, the opposite of the kind of Banksy. You know, this is me, Damien Hirst, here are my glasses, that's what I'm doing. You want a quotation, you want to talk, I'll talk. He extended his brand. I think Hirst is a master of branding and marketing. I mean, there's just 2 examples. The restaurant with, was it Marco Pierre White? Quo Vadis, I think it was, Philip? Yeah. And the pharmacy was one of his own creation. And of course, one of the most stunning things from my perspective, where he starts to explore and break the rules of the market, was how not only is it established on the marketplace, and high prices for objects being sold and so on and so forth, then in, I think it must have been 2007, Sotheby's auction house in London go to him and his management and say, hello, Damien, we would like to commission you to make 200 original works. And we would like the exclusive right to sell them at auction, at our auction. Unheard of, unprecedented. You know, not only an auction house commissioning an artist, but an artist. Traditionally, artists do not like their works sold at auction. They can't control their prices, they can go up and down, all that stuff. Hirst, very gung-ho, I imagine, sort of said, yeah, okay, we can do that. I'll make 200 works. What he said to his dealers about this, about cutting them out, or whatever, I don't know what kind of a contractual deal he had. He must have sorted something out with them, because normally you've got an exclusive obligation to sell through your gallery. So he sells it through Sotheby's, and they have an evening sale and a day sale. And the sales, and he did the catalogue inevitably, designed the catalogue, all that stuff. September the 15th and 16th, 2008. September the 15th and 16th, 2008. September the 15th and 16th, 2008. Okay? The two sales fetched under the hammer £111 million for the works, and nearly all of them were sold. The last day of the two-day sale was the day that Lehman Brothers crashed and burned. Talk about getting out before the ship sinks, or the Titanic sails at dawn, or whatever it may be. Luck, masterstroke, whatever. But it's playing the market, it's having that business acumen, insight, risk-taking, and dimension. So, just to kind of pull some thoughts together from those few examples. What are the challenges? Increasingly working collaboratively. It's very interesting. I've noticed through my work over the past 35 years, over the past 15 years or so, increasingly, and I know there are some artists in the room tonight, who have come together to work collaboratively, to work in twos, and threes, and fours maybe, on the creative partnership, which was traditionally not the case for the visual artists. It was in music and in other areas of the arts. And the reason why I think that has happened is because a lot of artists start to use either digital technology or mixed media, or moving more into the more conceptual kinds of work, stimulated in part, obviously, as I said, by Duchamp, to say we don't need to have just the hand and the eye of the artist traditionally anymore, where only one person can kind of do it usually, but we can actually create work where maybe two of us can regularly work together, and so on. And that's been a very, very significant feature of my experiences of the development of creative practice over the last 15 years or so. What do we want to achieve? What are we trying to do? Not necessarily create an object and sell it. Some recent trends. You probably know all these mixed media works, or time-based artworks, as they're often called, appropriation artists, or appropriation of material, that comes later. Open source and content material being used for the making of work using digital technology. Using the web to market the work as an open gallery. There are online, internet galleries now that it was just, for the life of me, I couldn't have imagined that when I first started out in the late 60s, 70s, where you've got a virtual gallery where works are being shown and bought and sold and even downloaded or authorized, whatever, through the use of the World Wide Web. Or one of the most successful auction houses in the world now operates online, and that's Saffron Art, working out of India. They started out as an online gallery, and they still have a very, very successful operation. And there are other, of course, traditionally, of course, auction houses need to have face-to-face physical contact with the work to have a look at it, to sell it. But in those countries where, as the Australians say, the tyranny of distance means that people can't get to the sale room, to the auction house, online becomes an issue. But one of the crucial factors is, if you're selling online, you must have a term and condition of sale that says, if you don't like it, we'll give you your money back, which is normally what doesn't happen in a face-to-face live auction with the work and the people in the room or on the telephone. Collaborating with curators and spaces, increasingly we're finding many creative artists are actually curating work of others and collaborating with others. Or gallerists or curators are saying, this is your excellent reference, Sandy, if I may say, to the 70s, was where you started to get spaces being opened up, certainly in London, saying, come and use this space. And that movement has taken hold very strongly as against bringing an object to a space. How can we use it? Installations, performative works, yeah. Sound art, blah, 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 appropriation art itself, and so on. Just some examples of recent trends as I have put them there. And to come to my last series of thoughts for you, just pulling it together in terms of my own, obviously natural professional concerns, is what kind of skills, what kind of knowledge do creative artists moving and operating in these fields need to have nowadays? Business skills, Christo, Jean-Claude, Damien Hirst, even Banksy, Allison Jackson. Entrepreneurial skills, how can we be imaginative in making business sense of what we do, and income generation. Advanced project management, absolutely. Business mechanisms, knowledge transfer. In other words, artists need to know. People are coming to me all the time. One of the things that happens in my consultancy is that we say we believe most strongly in knowledge transfer. When we help a creative artist or an art organisation and say, you know, we can help not just problem solving but with a creative project, we believe, and I believe very strongly, in knowledge transfer, saying, how can I help you to learn how to do this and do it yourself and stand on your own 2 feet? And artists are marvellous, in my experience, at saying, I need to know what you know, please tell me about it, or I'll pay you for something, and I can use it and build it into my practice. And this is really the heart of one of my most important thoughts to leave you with, is just what I consider to be the holistic approach. Sandy referred to the fact that I'm a visiting professor at the university here, and I'm proud to be so. I'm proud to be here tonight. But I've been working in what I call art schools, you know, studio-based art courses around the world, but a lot in the UK over the past 35 years. And the thing that I've noticed, the thing that really, really annoys me, is that there isn't a holistic approach in art schools to equipping artists with all these kind of things that I've been talking about this evening. You get art courses, whether it's undergraduate, whether it's postgraduate, whether it's studio, practice-based PhD, whatever. You get the staff, the students, the curriculum say, we'll have somebody like you, Henry, or an accountant, or some, I don't know, come in and talk to the students for 2 hours. It's not compulsory. People hardly ever turn up. They're usually down the studio. I've turned up at places in the north of England, for example, or it happened once at the Royal College, I kid you not. I went there, they booked me for a 3-hour talk about art and the law to students at the Royal College. There was nobody there. I said, did you not advertise this? Where is everybody? Oh, they're all down in the studios. Why? Because here we are in May and they've got their final shows and they're working on it. It's not compulsory. What did I do? Well, you know, you can imagine what I did. I went down to the studios, okay, and said, show me your work, can we talk about these things? And it kind of went off okay. And eventually they started running around, people were going around saying to their mates, hey, come here, quick, this is really interesting. And we said in somebody's studio, we did the whole thing there. But the point being is that the art schools, the universities, the colleges, whatever you want to say, do not have a serious commitment to professional practice studies, which are holistically embedded in the course, which require the artist to actually look at that area as well as the creative and technical area. Most of the institutions and the courses are based upon creativity and creativity alone. And any of these legal, business, entrepreneurial skills are just bolt-ons to it. And I think it should be embedded in the course. But that's, hey, that's me based upon my experience. And I think it's really important that it should be done. New extended skill sets. And also, you need to keep up to date and keep going with your professional development. And not just stand still in the way that you don't stand still with your art. You need to keep your business skills and entrepreneurial skills developing. Support and help. Yes, and that's one of the things that I do professionally. But also there are other organisations that do that as well, notably. And I'm not here to list those. I'm sure those of you who are here know something about it. Why do I say in some ways returning to the Renaissance model? One of the things that's always interested me and excited me over the years in a kind of boring, sort of academic, legalistic way is that a very dear friend of mine, who happens to be my wife, pointed out a book to me some years ago, as indeed a dear friend who's also here, who's an artist, Alan Smith, who pointed out a couple of publications which have been written about the contracts of the artist in the Renaissance. And looking and reading at those, for me, was absolutely fascinating. Where the Renaissance artist, the maestro in the studio, with all the assistants and everything else, was operating in a kind of Warholian way, in a Banksy type way, and saying, we've got this business. And those contracts and the letters between the commissioner, the patron, and the artist were absolutely fantastic. Those guys, and they were guys mostly, were consummate business professionals. And somewhere along the way between then and now, that's gone. And it shouldn't be absent. It needs to be there. Some people get it naturally. Some people just get lucky. Thank you.
Henry, thank you very much. Well, there's a moment now for questions or challenges or
anything.
Who'd like to start?
How would you see those sort of skills embedded in a course? How could you imagine that would work?
I think one of the things that I think needs to happen is that you need to work with the course directors, the curriculum writers and the course validators to say what is required. There's a vast amount of research done as to what people need. Talk to the students, talk to newly qualified practitioners. What do you need? And anyone at any stage in their career, what do you need? Even, the 60 and 70-year-old artist will tell you what you need at least is to be able to work out how to create a pension for yourself. You say to my artist friends and clients, have you got a pension scheme? You're in your 50s now, you're in your 60s now. Or the 88-year-old artist who brings up and says, I can't paint anymore because I'm going blind. Can you help me with my legacy and all that stuff? And I say, okay, have you got a pension? She said, a pension? You must be joking. I've got a state pension. I said, okay. When you ever had any spare money, what did you do with your spare money during your career? Answer? What's an artist's answer?
Didn't have it.
You either didn't have it or you put it into your work. End of story. So you would build on that, Robin. I think that's where I would start and say, okay, and then what's needed, and then how can it be delivered, and who can it be delivered by? I think a lot of the problem is the course directors in art, higher education in art, have not got the equipment themselves to be able to do it, understandably, but there are ways in which they could be helped to learn that and to help it to be delivered to their students. And I think there are ways in which you can build in a little assessment and say, okay, you're going to set up a studio, you're going to do a deal with a deal, whatever. Something like that. Sorry, there was somebody else.
There's a question behind.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
Stanley.
Sorry?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, you said at the beginning something about asking the question whether it's possible to sustain an oppositional practice in terms of the art market.
Yeah.
And I went to the Michael Langley show this afternoon, and I saw that
Yeah.
Do you think, what is your take on that?
My take on that, I don't know. My take on the don't take the photograph, or
I still got the
just start with Michael Landy's conceptual piece, the work itself.
No, I was just thinking about whether it's possible to really to make a piece that is in some sense a critique of the art market. Because clearly that work is so totally embedded in the idea of a unique art object.
Well, I mean, the thing is, just get the idea and just go for it. And then if you're nervous about something, consult somebody like me. I was just thinking about, Sammy, remember that in the 80s, that American artist based in the UK called Stephen Boggs, J.S. Boggs, who did works which were hand-drawn counterfeits of treasury notes, which was more of a conceptual piece than anything else. A lot of people thought it was just like showing these objects. But it was about barter, it was about value, it was about the marketplace, it was about currency, so all sorts of things. And he just went ahead and did it. And somebody blew in his ear and said, Stephen, it's a criminal offence, you could be sent to prison for forging any version of the treasury note. So Stephen Boggs wrote to the governor of the Bank of England and said, hello, I'm making this work, I'm just a young unknown emerging artist, whatever. I'm doing hand-drawn versions of one side of your treasury notes. I'm a foreigner, somebody said I'm not allowed to do it and I need your permission. Will you give me your permission? The governor didn't write back and didn't give permission, but a minion wrote to him and said, stop doing your work immediately, it is a criminal offence or else we'll prosecute you. So he carried on, inevitably. He then got arrested, and so did the work in the gallery, and he got prosecuted, and he went to the Old Bailey, and I was in the defence team to defend him, and it was, we said, a jury trial at the Old Bailey, in Court 1 at the Old Bailey, where Crippen and all the terrorists and everything else, there was Stephen sitting in the dock with all the, the iron bars and all that stuff. And what is he doing throughout the trial? He's drawing treasury notes all the time. And the jailer says to him, you can't draw in the dock. And he said, well, what are the rules? And he said to me, can I do this? And I said, yeah, but the judge is going to get really pissed off if you do. Blah, blah, blah. It was a jury trial. It lasted 3 days. The juror retired for 15 minutes. We ran a defence that said, this is not a violation of the Counterfeiting Act, this is art. And we turned the gallery into, as best we could, we turned the courtroom into a gallery. We gave them a seminar by calling witnesses to talk about art. Sandy, you were one of the witnesses. Absolutely. You remember exactly.
But the interesting thing on that case
Go for it,
was
Sam.
that, I was thinking about it on that case. What was interesting was that it wasn't actually, if you remember counterfeiting, it was that there's an obscure bit of Bank of England's legislative powers that says you're not allowed to reproduce a banknote. And the whole thing turned on what was reproduction. And then it got interesting because you and the others on the defence team got interested, of course, in saying he wasn't trying to reproduce them. I mean, nobody thought he was making an image of them. There's a difference between, it wasn't Xerox.
And then we talked about representation of.
All the questions about representation. But I think your question is very interesting to me because I think that, whether it's Michael Landy or lots of different artists have found different moments to test, Michael's breakdown and now this new art bin work. I think, Henry, I understand what you're saying is that, in a way, you're encouraging artists to say that it's a natural thing that artists will test what is legitimate. I think you're also saying it's a good idea to take advice so that you don't end up in Court 1 in the Old Bailey.
Yeah, exactly.
But you are also saying that you, if I'm understanding right, you'd be very worried if artists backed away from testing the limits of what is legitimate.
Absolutely, totally right, Sandy. Absolutely, spot on.
I mean, you'd be worried if we had a culture in which that wasn't going to take place. We will have tests, and some of those tests will be, as we know from other instances, will be uncomfortable. Certainly the tests around obscenity, as we know, have often been very uncomfortable because the overlap between moral, cultural, and the law are very, very difficult.
You're absolutely right. One of the things that happened in the 80s when American artists were pushing the boundaries of what art could be and what images could be represented to the public, a lot of artists were exploring the use of pornographic imagery, violent imagery, bodily fluids, all start to emerge. And eventually, somebody got prosecuted under the criminal law, and eventually they were convicted, and they appealed and appealed and appealed. And eventually the appeal went to the Supreme Court. And it was a classic case. The Supreme Court was asked to say, is this pornography? Because if it is, it's a criminal offence. And of course their defence was the First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, all that stuff. There's a clash between the Constitution and the law. And the Supreme Court's job is to reconcile those two things, to interpret. And the Supreme Court, bless them, came out and said, the Constitution is supreme, and therefore freedom of speech rules. Pornography can be art, just as art can be pornography. And I've had clients come to me saying...
But Henry, your consistency is for people to be informed.
Yes.
So whatever their opinion, whatever they want to do.
Okay.
Other question?
Next.
He lost. He won. 50
He won, yeah.
He won.
The artist won, yeah. Or the artist and gallery won, yeah.
Serrano.
I was going to say one small thing, which was that there is an aspect of making art whereby if you have no reaction to your work by the state,
Yeah.
it actually is often not successful.
I'm sure that
because
many
it has
artists
no,
would say-
to be ignored is a failure in a way.
Well, that's sort of it. I take it as the implication partly in Duchamp, and that Duchamp quote, and what's alarming about, in a way, about what Duchamp says in Bit of Quoted is that sense, of course, that there are thousands of artists, as we all know, making actually wonderful works of art with people who have joined, but in a way what Duchamp's saying is that's not enough, because he is pushing for something else.
But if you deal with the law and the law doesn't respond, then
Yes, then you may get...
That's what
you
No, I understand.
don't wish for what you want.
That kind of stuff.
Yes.
I was wondering in how far this type of artist you were constructing today, and how far it was generalizable to the larger majority of...
I don't know. There are some other people more expert in that than me in the room, I know, here, who could probably give you a view. I would say they are in the minority in terms of the volume of millions of artists around the world. But my view and experience are the ones that are pushing the boundaries further forward than any others, by demonstrating that there are unique ways of exploring the visual.
Because it seems to me it's hugely demanding, isn't it, to be completely self-managed and a self-managed entity, like in the Renaissance sense, isn't it?
Well, I know that... Sorry, Helen.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, the examples that Henry's given, I think it's fair to say, involve artists bringing in their association, I mean, in association with them, people with other skills, with management skills alongside their own skills. I mean, certainly, Damien is a very good example of bringing in business skills alongside him. So, I wouldn't regard Damien Hirst as self-managed.
absolutely not.
I mean,
No,
because his, in a sense, his Damien Hirst Enterprises, in which there are others who have, quasi, business roles. I mean, however,
When, Freeze, for example, his original Freeze, I think he then was an exceptionally entrepreneurial artist. He really understood brand,
No,
really understood marketing. He knew how to create something using all the other artists in a way that was very self-managed and very savvy indeed, I think.
My question would be, why is that written? Because it seems to me that markets actually thrive on repetition. And why, of course, that's the well-known artist, because it produces more of the same. And actually creative practice can't exist in markets, because markets don't have recognize it. Markets recognize things that have a precedent, that ought to have. So
I don't know,
I wonder why, wait. I wonder why you think Damien Hirst is someone who has a creative practice.
if it's not obvious to you, I can't explain it now. But I think that most artists, in my experience, engage with the marketplace, if only to generate some kind of income for themselves. Because, obviously, there's two principal values of the work. There's the value to the spectator, the curatorial value, the art historical value, the canonistic value, the original value, the originality value, and then there's the market value. Many artists don't engage with the market. Banksy, who I refer to here, I deliberately mean because he didn't engage with the market. The market engaged with him. And once the market's knocking on the door and saying, we'd like to buy something, Is he going to refuse? Maybe he could and should have done.
To do that in the first place.
I'm sorry,
So wasn't that just shrewd of Banksy? Wasn't he aware of that?
I don't know. I suspect there wasn't a plan.
There are plenty, there are plenty of examples, to your point, there are plenty of interesting examples on the business models where there are very fine lines between consistency and change. I'm thinking, for instance, of the fashion world. And the fashion world is very interesting about where if you carry on doing the same thing, you get nowhere. But if you go too far, you get nowhere equally. And that gets very interesting, I think, where there are creative business models that certainly aren't just about consistency.
So I guess my question would be, surely the really creative practice is to find ways that both inside and outside the market, and that you want to see the market as the only vehicle that
Yeah, I understand. All I would say, offer you in terms of thinking about that is that for most of his life, Duchamp never sold a work at all. For most of his life. And I don't think you and I would disagree that he was a creative artist.
But he had become a revered figure. Whatever else he was like.
Sure.
He had image control.
That, in a way, that backs up my point, that he was truly creative because he existed outside of the market.
Yeah, but he's the...
Private income.
I'm sorry. He also had private income, yeah. He also earned money from gambling, chess. Yeah. Sandy, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I can take a couple more, and then, in a minute, we have a chance to chat over a drink with the University Arts. He's nice enough to us all to invite us for a drink in a minute. So we're going to take a couple more, and then
Just
we're
very
going to...
briefly, it's not, I'm not sure who's the answer, it certainly isn't mine, but a man called Bear, who is a commentator in the art market, had pointed out that the art movement, through all the movements of the 20th century, late 19th and through the 20th century, the art movement of the first decade of the 21st century is the art market itself.
Ah, I see.
Let's take
Nice
this one, and then there's another one there, and then we'll finish this.
I think just going back to the point you were making about Damien Hirst, I think you let him off a bit lightly. Because if somebody comes to you and say, oh, can you just give me 50 or 30 pieces of work or whatever, and he goes away, you could probably go to an art college and buy a 30 piece of work and sell it to them. So the question about the creativity is like, what is it that drives you? And if you're not driven by wanting to do something, he's supposed to be really upset that they call his new work as being Baconesque and so on because it's supposed to be really him. He's getting pissed off about that. But if somebody approaches you and say, give us 100 pieces of work and we'll vlog it, and he says, all right, I'll have it done by next week, then you think, where's the creativity in that?
There are very few artists in my experience that would refuse the offer of a purchase of something.
We're talking about a creative act.
Yeah, last one.
I was wondering, you've got to exclude many artists and include currently, but in this kind of platform, to not have the name Andy Warhol mentioned seemed to me a bit of a large exclusion. But the purpose, the thing that sparked off, how to get it into the equation is just from what you were saying. Because Andy Warhol was not collaborative from the business point of view at all. He ran his entire business, and it was a monstrous, huge-sized affair in the end. It would be incredibly badly run because nobody could help it. But that's an example of the fact that Andy Warhol, who was extraordinarily influential in the second half of the century, as much as Marcel Duchamp was possibly in the first half, and completely turned the whole thing on its head. Marcel Duchamp never sold work. Andy Warhol sold purposely not just to sell it, and he did it. And he did it in a Renaissance fashion. And he had employees and people shocking the world with all of that stuff. But he did it on his own, pretty much. As far as the business.
He did have Fred Hughes, though.
Well, okay, yeah.
For better or worse.
Sorry?
For better
or worse. Yes.
Sorry, for those who don't know, Fred Hughes was his
World
business manager.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of
But you're right, it's a very good.
it's just as time has moved on,
Yeah.
and the markets are so much bigger, and in order to do a kind of Andy Warhol kind of thing today, you can't be as singular as Andy Warhol was in
I think there are many more questions, but can we bring the questions? I was very, just at that point, I was very amused that in the middle of the .com boom, some of you may not wish to remember, but there was such a thing, there was a company who were great developers of web businesses and .com businesses called Science. And Science were one of the great international consultancies working on tremendous business opportunities. I was hugely amused that the premises that science got hold of was the factory. And it is a wonderful sort of return to the idea that the space that Warhol had was now this bizarre space of these young sort of Martian people trying to make documents as well. Anyway, that's enough digression. Henry, you've given us a wonderful sense of, in a way of saying things that matter crucially, but also a lightness about how we might think about them, how we might approach them, how we come back to both old truths and new truths. And you've given us a sense of your passion, I think, about why all this matters. It matters to all of us in different ways in this room and well beyond. So thank you very much for giving us the creative act revisited in new ways.